Anna hurried through the bustling streets of the city, her coat pulled tight against the biting late winter chill. The sidewalks were a blur of hurried commuters and indifferent faces, everyone too preoccupied to notice anything beyond their own paths. The sharp wind cut through the air, and the city seemed unforgiving, its coldness reflected in the hurried, unseeing crowd. As she passed a dimly lit bus stop, something caught her eye, a figure huddled on the bench, clutching a tattered blanket. The man looked frail, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world bore down on him. His thin jacket was no match for the weather, and his face was marked by exhaustion and despair. He didn't meet anyone's gaze, instead staring blankly at the ground, invisible to the passers-by. Anna slowed her pace, her heart tugged by the sight. She glanced at her watch, reminded of the errands piling up. For a moment, she hesitated, torn between her packed schedule and the silent plea etched in his hunched figure. But the gnawing voice of her conscience was louder. With a deep breath, she approached him, offering a warm smile and a bag of food. "Here, this might help," she said, sat down cautiously beside James, her breath visible in the cold air. She handed him the warm sandwich she'd just bought, and a steaming cup of coffee. At first, he hesitated, his hands trembling as he accepted them, muttering a barely audible thank you. His voice was hoarse, as if unused to conversation. Encouraged by his gratitude, Anna gently asked, "How long have you been out here?" James glanced at her, his tired eyes betraying a mix of shame and vulnerability. "Too long," he murmured. After a pause, he added, "I wasn't always like this. I had a business once, a small gallery. Art was my life. Then, things fell apart. My wife got sick, medical bills piled up. By the time I lost her, I'd lost everything else too." His words were heavy with pain, and Anna found herself unable to look away. As he spoke, doubts crept into Anna's mind. Was she being naive? Was it wise to help someone she barely knew? She thought of the warnings she'd heard, about scams, about people taking advantage of kindness. But as she watched him cradle the coffee like it was a lifeline, she realized how easy it was to dehumanize someone in his position. She pushed her doubts aside. "Come on," she said softly, standing up. "There's a shelter nearby. They'll have a warm bed and more food." James hesitated, his pride warring with his need. But something in her tone, genuine, unjudging, convinced him. He nodded, struggling to his feet. As they walked to the shelter, Anna talked to him about art, drawing fragments of the person he used to be out of the shadows. James's answers were tentative at first, but as he opened up, she saw glimpses of a man who had once lived a vibrant life. At the shelter, Anna made sure he was settled before leaving. As she said goodbye, she smiled. "You're not invisible, James. People care. Don't give up." For the first time, he looked at her directly, his tired eyes glinting with something she hadn't seen before, hope. Anna left, knowing she'd made the right choice, unaware of how much this single act would change both their lives. Anna couldn't stop thinking about James after she left him at the shelter. The way his eyes had lit up, even briefly, as they talked about art stayed with her. On an impulse, she decided to visit the shelter the next day. She arrived with a bag of essentials, warm clothes, toiletries, and a sketch pad. When James saw her, surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by gratitude. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said, managing a small smile. Anna shrugged playfully. "I wasn't sure either, but I figured you might need these." She handed him the sketch pad, and for a moment, he just stared at it. Then, he opened it, running his fingers over the blank pages like they were made of gold. "It's been years since I held one of these," he murmured. Over the next few days, Anna made a habit of visiting James. At first, Their conversations were light, small talk about the weather or the shelter's meals. But as he grew more comfortable, James began to open up. He spoke about his past with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He had owned a modest but successful gallery downtown, showcasing local artists and occasionally his own works. "I wasn't famous or anything," he said with a chuckle, "but people appreciated what I brought to the community." Anna listened intently, fascinated by his stories. He spoke with such detail and passion about the art world, using terms she didn't fully understand but found captivating nonetheless. Yet, there was a shadow that lingered over his words. Whenever she asked about what happened to the gallery or his art, his answers became vague. "Life happens," he would say, or "it's all gone now." She didn't press him, sensing his reluctance. One day, as he sketched absent-mindedly in the pad she had brought, James mentioned a painting he used to own, a piece he had poured his heart into. "It was the last thing I created before everything fell apart," he said quietly. "It's probably lost now, like everything else." There was a wistfulness in his tone, but also a hint of something else, regret, perhaps. Anna couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. As James reached for his cup of tea, Anna noticed something she hadn't seen before, an intricate tattoo on his wrist. It was partially obscured by his sleeve, but she could make out a detailed design of swirling lines and a small emblem in the center. "That's beautiful," she said, gesturing to it. James glanced at his wrist and quickly pulled his sleeve down. "Just a reminder of better times," he muttered, brushing off her curiosity. But Anna couldn't let it go. There was something familiar about the emblem in the tattoo, though she couldn't quite place it. That night, she found herself researching symbols online, trying to match the design in her memory. Nothing concrete came up, but the nagging feeling persisted. Who exactly was James? How had someone so intelligent, talented, and full of life ended up in such a dire situation? And what was he hiding? Her visits to James became more frequent, their conversations deeper. She noticed how his demeanor began to change. He stood a little taller, his voice carried more strength, and his sketches became more vibrant, as if the act of creating art was breathing life back into him. Yet, the more he revealed about himself, the more questions Anna had. She couldn't shake the sense that there was a larger story waiting to unfold, and she was determined to piece it together. Unbeknownst to her, those pieces were already starting to fall into place, and the truth about James would soon come to light in a way she could never have imagined. Anna couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to James's story. Every detail he shared, every moment of hesitation in his voice, felt like a piece of a puzzle she couldn't fully see. The tattoo on his wrist haunted her thoughts, as did his vague references to a painting he once created. Determined to help him, she decided to dig deeper. Her search began online. She spent hours scouring art forums, gallery archives, and local news articles, using the sparse details James had shared, his love for art, his gallery, and his downfall. After days of fruitless searching, Anna stumbled upon an old feature article from nearly a decade ago. It profiled an artist named James Elliott, who had gained modest acclaim for his evocative, emotional paintings. The accompanying photo was unmistakable. Though thinner and aged by hardship, the James in the picture was the same man she had met at the bus stop. The article mentioned a painting titled Ethereal Grace, which had been his magnum opus. Anna read that it had been sold to a private collector before James disappeared from the art world. The story hinted at financial troubles, a betrayal by a business partner, and the death of his wife, all contributing to his mysterious departure from public life. Her heart ached as she pieced together the narrative. James wasn't just a man who had lost everything, he was an artist whose soul had been poured into his work, only to have it shattered by life's cruelties. Curiosity and determination drove Anna, to visit a prominent art gallery downtown that specialized in modern classics. She approached the curator, explaining her interest in James Eliot. The curator's eyes widened at the mention of his name. James Eliot, he echoed. He was a genius, truly ahead of his time. But he vanished. A tragedy, really. Anna asked about Ethereal Grace, and the curator led her to a room reserved for their most prized pieces. There, hanging under soft lighting, was the painting. Anna gasped. The canvas was breathtaking, a swirling blend of light and shadow, depicting a woman's silhouette reaching toward an unseen horizon. It was haunting, beautiful, and alive with emotion. The small plaque beneath the painting listed its estimated value, $2.5 million. Who owns it now? Anna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The curator explained that the painting had been auctioned years ago and was currently on loan from a private collector. He shared more details about James's story, how his partner had embezzled funds from the gallery, leaving James bankrupt and unable to recover. The loss of his wife soon after had been the final blow. James had disappeared without a trace, presumed to have left the art world forever. Shaken by everything she'd learned, Anna left the gallery. Her mind raced with questions. Why had James never told her the full truth? Did he think no one would care, or was it his shame holding him back? She knew she couldn't keep this to herself. James deserved to know that his work still lived on, cherished and celebrated, even if he had lost faith in it. The next day, Anna visited the shelter, clutching a printout of the gallery article about Ethereal Grace. She found James in the common area, sketching on the pad she'd given him. When he saw her, he smiled faintly, but his expression shifted when he noticed her serious demeanor. "James, we need to talk," Anna said gently but firmly. She sat across from him, placing the article on the table. His eyes flickered to it, and the color drained from his face. He didn't say a word, but his hands trembled as he reached for the paper. "I know," Anna said softly. "I know who you are. I saw your painting yesterday. Ethereal Grace. It's beautiful, James. It's still out there, inspiring people." James stared at the article, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had returned to him. "I didn't want anyone to know," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "That part of my life, it's gone. It's not me anymore." "But it is you," Anna insisted. "You created something extraordinary. You're still that man." James shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "I lost everything. My wife, my gallery, my reputation. When the betrayal happened, everyone turned their back on me. And when my wife died, I didn't have the strength to fight anymore. I walked away from it all, my art, my name. I didn't deserve to be remembered." Anna's heart broke at his words. "You're wrong," she said firmly. "Your art is still changing lives. People see your work and feel something real. That doesn't just disappear because you've been through pain. You deserve to reclaim that." James sat silently, tears streaming down his face. He admitted that he'd hidden his identity out of shame and fear that he'd be judged for his failures, fear that he was no longer the man he once was. "But you saw me," he said, his voice trembling. "You didn't turn away." Anna reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "Because you're worth seeing, James. And it's not too late to come back. Your story isn't over." For the first time in years, James felt the walls around his heart begin to crack. The pain was still there, but so was something else, a flicker of hope. He realized that maybe, just maybe, Anna was right. His story wasn't over yet. And with her by his side, he might find the courage to start a new chapter. Sitting together in the shelter's quiet common room, Anna could see the vulnerability etched into James's face. His confession about his past left the air heavy with emotion, but also with possibility. She leaned forward, her voice steady yet gentle. "James, your story isn't just about loss, it's about survival. You've endured so much, but you're still here. That means something." James shook his head, his hands fidgeting with the edges of his sketchpad. "I'm not the man I used to be. Who would want to hear my story? What's left of me to inspire anyone?" His voice cracked, and Anna could see the weight of his self-doubt crushing him. She placed her hand over his. "Everything. You've lived through pain most people couldn't imagine, and yet you still have this incredible gift. Your art, James, it's not just paint on a canvas. It's a reflection of hope, struggle, and resilience. Sharing that could help others who feel lost, just like you did." James's eyes glistened, but he said nothing. Instead, he reached into the tattered bag at his feet and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "I've kept this," he said softly, handing it to her. "It's the only thing I have left." Anna carefully unfolded the paper, revealing a delicate sketch of a woman. The lines were worn, but the love and detail in the drawing were undeniable. "It's her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My wife. I made it the day we found out she was sick. I've carried it with me ever since." Tears welled in Anna's eyes as she held the fragile piece of James's heart in her hands. The depth of his love and the pain of his loss were captured in every stroke. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice trembling. "And so are you, James. You have to share this with the world." For the first time, James smiled, a real, unguarded smile. In that moment, Anna realized that her kindness had been more than just a gesture. It had been a spark. By seeing James for who he truly was, she had given him the courage to begin again. And in doing so, she discovered something profound, that small acts of compassion could ignite transformation in ways she never imagined. Weeks passed, and the world began to rediscover James Elliott. With Anna's encouragement, he shared his story and artwork, starting with a small local gallery. The response was overwhelming. His journey, from celebrated artist to forgotten soul, and now to a symbol of resilience, captured hearts. Media outlets picked up the story, dubbing him the artist who returned from the shadows. His work, now revered not just for its beauty but its message of survival, became a beacon of hope for many. One sunny afternoon, Anna received a call from James, asking her to meet him at the gallery. When she arrived, she was greeted with warm smiles and whispers of admiration. James stood at the center of the room, surrounded by his restored legacy. In his hand was a carefully wrapped canvas. "This is for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Anna unwrapped it, revealing a breathtaking painting of a woman standing under a radiant sky, her arms outstretched toward the horizon. It was titled The Catalyst. "You reminded me who I am," James said. "This is yours." Tears filled Anna's eyes as she realized the depth of his gratitude. Reflecting on how a single act of kindness had transformed both their lives, she understood, no good deed is ever truly small. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe our channel for more interesting stories.